The internet loves a messy celebrity storyline, but this one didn't start as entertainment. It started as a private situation that somehow exploded into a public spectacle, dragging names that were never supposed to be part of the conversation. Suddenly, Taylor Swift is being framed as collateral damage, Blake Lively is at the center of a storm, and Justin Baldoni is facing allegations that hinge less on direct actions and more on interpretation. And once private texts, voicemails, and internal notes start floating around, the narrative stops being simple. According to reports, Taylor Swift wants absolutely nothing to do with this drama. Her position is straightforward. Private messages were never meant to become public, and having them exposed feels like a violation. That reaction isn't surprising. Anyone would be uncomfortable watching personal conversations get dissected online. But what makes this situation complicated is how those messages ended up in the public sphere in the first place. Legal disputes come with discovery, and once lawsuits are filed, privacy becomes a fragile thing. That reality doesn't make the exposure feel fair, but it does make it predictable. What's being emphasized publicly is the idea that Taylor was simply being a supportive friend. She was asked to read scripts, she was told she didn't have to, she showed up without expecting to be pulled into anything larger. That's the framing, but timing matters. Messages were sent while other key people were still present. Situations overlapped instead of being kept separate. And when everything is later placed under a legal microscope, even casual involvement starts to look strategic, whether it was intended that way or not. As the focus shifts away from Taylor, the heart of the controversy becomes a 4.5-minute voice memo sent in early February 2023. It's long, emotional, and deeply personal. In it, Blake Lively speaks openly about stress, exhaustion, and pressure following the birth of her fourth child. She talks about juggling multiple film schedules, lacking proper childcare support, and feeling physically unprepared to return to work. The message isn't polished, it rambles. It feels like someone venting rather than negotiating. A major theme of that voicemail is time. Time to rest, time to prepare, time to get her body where she personally wants it to be before stepping back in front of the camera. She repeatedly explains that shooting too soon feels overwhelming, especially while trying to work out, recover, and meet the expectations tied to a high-profile film. She emphasizes that these feelings are hers, that she's speaking as a friend, and that she wants the message kept private. What stands out isn't just the vulnerability, but the framing. The stress around weight and appearance comes from her own internal pressure, not from any explicit demand being placed on her. She talks about wanting to feel confident, wanting to be in her best shape, and wanting more time because she doesn't believe she can realistically achieve that any sooner. It's an admission of insecurity, not an accusation. That distinction becomes crucial later because the core allegation that emerges is fat shaming. Yet within this message, the concern about weight is self-driven. There's no demand, no criticism, no external push referenced. In fact, subsequent messages show reassurance coming from the other side, emphasizing comfort, collaboration, and support rather than judgment. The pressure appears internal, even if the environment amplifies it. At the same time, this insecurity didn't appear overnight. Blake Lively has spoken for years about feeling physically big in an industry that rewards being small. Long before pregnancy, she described towering over others, feeling masculine, and struggling with her body image. Those feelings didn't vanish with success, motherhood, or experience. They followed her into every phase of her career, shaping how she approached wardrobe and public perception. That history matters because it suggests a pattern rather than a single incident. When wardrobe choices leaned toward oversized clothing during filming, public backlash followed. Instead of seeing it as a stylistic choice or personal comfort decision, audiences criticized the look. That criticism then became part of the emotional weight surrounding the production. Body image wasn't just a personal struggle anymore, it was being debated online in real time. As the timeline unfolds, it becomes clear that the issue wasn't one moment or one comment. It was a buildup. Early interactions between all parties were friendly. Social media engagement was positive. Messages were cordial. Then conversations about scheduling, physical readiness, and creative control intensified. Requests were made. Some were accommodated, others weren't. And when expectations collided with logistical reality, frustration started filling the gaps. By the time weight entered the conversation explicitly, the foundation was already shaky. A request made for practical reasons was interpreted emotionally. Information shared through a third party escalated instead of being clarified. That escalation didn't stay private. It spread to friends, partners, and eventually the media. What began as personal insecurity transformed into a public accusation, and once that line was crossed, there was no clean way back. At this stage, what's visible isn't a clear villain or a clean victim. It's a situation where vulnerability, pressure, and power dynamics collided inside a massive production machine. And once legal action started pulling every message, memo, and note into daylight, the story stopped being about intent and started being about interpretation. As tensions quietly escalated, the situation stopped being just about feelings and started becoming procedural. Text messages from mid-February 2023 show Blake Lively directly asking if scenes involving body exposure could be scheduled toward the end of filming. The reasoning was practical on the surface, more time to feel physically ready. The response she received wasn't dismissive or cold, it was reassuring. She was told she would look great, that any insecurity could be worked through creatively, and that the goal was her comfort above all else. There was no pressure, no demand, and no ultimatum. At the same time, those same concerns were being shared elsewhere. Messages sent to her agent mirrored the exact anxiety about weight, time, and appearance. She described working out obsessively, treating it like a full-time job, and still feeling like the timeline was unrealistic after recently giving birth. She openly acknowledged that the sexiness of the film mattered commercially, even while struggling personally with the physical expectations attached to that idea. The contradiction is hard to ignore, recognizing the marketing need for sex appeal while simultaneously feeling overwhelmed by what it takes to deliver it. Behind the scenes, the narrative began shifting. Creative disagreements started being interpreted as personal slights. Suggestions meant to ease pressure were reframed as judgment. Supportive gestures were later described as inappropriate. What once looked like collaborative problem-solving slowly became evidence in a growing internal case against one person. And once that shift happens, every interaction gets reprocessed through a new lens. One of the most explosive moments came when weight was discussed indirectly through a trainer. The context was practical. A known back issue required accurate information for safety reasons. The trainer involved wasn't random, he was recommended personally. But instead of staying contained, the information traveled fast. It reached Blake, then Ryan, then a private confrontation followed, not in a neutral space, but in a setting loaded with power, influence, and witnesses. That moment didn't resolve anything, it hardened positions. From there, the story escaped the room. What happened privately became a headline. Allegations of fat shaming surfaced publicly before any formal clarification could occur. Once the accusation was out, nuance didn't matter anymore. The conversation was no longer about what was said or why, it was about how it felt and how it looked, and optics are everything in Hollywood. As filming continued, wardrobe became another pressure point. Blake had taken control of styling decisions, sidelining the original department. Paparazzi photos hit the internet, and backlash followed almost instantly. Oversized outfits were mocked. The criticism was loud. Instead of being absorbed as public noise, it fed back into the ongoing narrative. The response wasn't adjustment, it was resentment. Another perceived attack added to the pile.
Then came the creative conflict over intimacy. Requests were made to reduce or reframe scenes. When those requests weren't fully granted, the situation escalated again. Even attempts to redistribute focus, shifting the camera toward the male lead instead, were reinterpreted negatively. By this point, intention didn't matter. Everything had become confirmation of an already decided belief. What makes this phase critical is that none of these moments existed in isolation. Each one stacked onto the last, stress layered over insecurity, insecurity layered over control, control layered over conflict, and instead of diffusing, the environment amplified every reaction. The film set stopped being just a workplace and became an emotional pressure cooker. By late spring, the working relationship had fractured. Behind-the-scenes commentary turned openly hostile. Creative disagreements were no longer negotiated, they were weaponized. Texts were archived, timelines were built. Every moment was logged, not to resolve issues, but to support a future narrative. At that point, the outcome was already drifting away from collaboration and toward confrontation. What started as exhaustion after childbirth had evolved into something much larger, a story about power, perception, and accountability. And once lawyers entered the picture, the emotional reality of the situation took a back seat to documentation. The truth was no longer lived, it was being assembled. As the legal framing took shape, internal documents started telling a very different story than the public accusations. Notes from studio executives reviewing the script made one thing clear: the push for a more sexual, more intense tone did not originate from one individual. The feedback explicitly called for more heat, more intimacy, and a rating that matched the expectations of an adult audience familiar with the source material. The concern wasn't restraint, it was the opposite. The project was seen as too tame. These notes stressed that the film couldn't rely on language alone to justify a mature rating. Audiences were expecting something grown, layered, and emotionally charged. Studio leadership wanted intimacy not just confined to bedroom scenes, but woven throughout the story in subtle adult ways. That guidance placed responsibility for those choices on both leads and the director, framing intimacy as a shared creative decision rather than a unilateral demand. That context matters because the lawsuit later reframed those same creative discussions as harassment. Words like sexy and hot, which appear repeatedly in studio feedback, were retroactively described as inappropriate. But the paper trail shows those descriptors coming directly from executives responsible for shaping the final product. The expectation was set early, reinforced often, and tied to commercial performance, not personal fixation. At the same time, the final cut of the film revealed a tonal imbalance that many viewers noticed immediately. The movie opens like a romantic drama, almost light in its pacing and dialogue, before sharply pivoting into something much darker. That whiplash wasn't accidental, it reflected unresolved creative tension during production. Scenes felt rewritten, softened, or redirected midstream, leaving characters inconsistent and motivations underdeveloped. Dialogue choices became another point of friction. Several moments felt juvenile, undercutting the seriousness of the story. Critics and viewers questioned how certain characters fell in love at all, given how abrasive or self-centered their interactions appeared. Those lines weren't in early drafts, they were added late, improvised, adjusted on set, and those adjustments fundamentally changed how audiences perceived the characters. As scrutiny intensified, older interviews resurfaced. Past comments about body image, height, and feeling physically large were re-examined under a new lens. What once sounded like insecurity now appeared prophetic. Industry anecdotes followed, describing long-standing discomfort with sizing labels and wardrobe fittings. These stories didn't create the issue, but they contextualized it. The struggle wasn't new, it had just reached a breaking point. Then came outside pressure. Messages sent by Ryan Reynolds to the director added another layer of influence. Framed as supportive, they nonetheless pushed for schedule changes and family accommodations that ignored the logistical reality of a full production. The tone blurred the line between advocacy and leverage, reinforcing the power imbalance already present. Even humor in those messages landed poorly, given the seriousness of the situation. By the time the narrative reached the public, it had already been shaped behind closed doors. Texts were selected, timelines were curated, motives were inferred. What the audience received wasn't the full complexity of a collapsing collaboration, it was a simplified storyline designed for impact. And once that version spread, correcting it became nearly impossible. In the end, this wasn't a story about one voicemail, one comment, or one request. It was about how personal insecurity, creative control, and public accountability collided inside an industry that rarely slows down long enough to let people recover. When that collision happens, intent gets buried, context gets flattened, and everyone involved becomes part of a narrative they can't fully control anymore.